Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savages. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
Unconfirmed by Allied sources, of course, says that heavy fighting is taking place between the Germans and invasion forces on the Normandy Peninsula, about 31 miles southwest of Le Havre. Another bulletin, also from Berlin Radio and unconfirmed, says that British-American landing operations against the western coast of Europe from the sea and from the air are stretching over the entire area between Cherbourg and Le Havre, a distance of about 60 miles.
On this episode of Newt's World, 80 years ago today, on June 6, 1944, General Dwight David Eisenhower addressed the thousands of American troops preparing to invade Normandy, encouraging them to embrace the great crusade they faced. Then, in a brief moment alone, he drafted a resignation letter in case the invasion failed. He wanted people to know that it was his responsibility and not the responsibility of the thousands of young men and women that he was throwing at Nazi Germany. In his new book, The Light of Battle, Michel Paradis brings Dwight Eisenhower to life as he learns to navigate the cross-currents of diplomacy, politics, strategy, family, and fame, with the fate of the free world hanging in the balance. In a world of giants, Churchill, Roosevelt, de Gaulle, Marshall, MacArthur, it was a barefoot boy from Abilene, Kansas, who would master the art of power and become a modern-day George Washington. Paradis reveals how Eisenhower's rise both reflected and was integral to America's rise as a global superpower. Here to talk about his new book and the 80th anniversary of D-Day, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Michel Paradis. He's a leading human rights lawyer, historian, national security law scholar, and most recently, the author of the critically acclaimed Last Mission to Tokyo. He's a partner at the international law firm Curtis Mallet Provost and a lecturer at Columbia Law School. Michel, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you so much for having me on.
You know, this is the 80th anniversary of an extraordinary moment when so many landed both by air, by sea, and it hung in the balance. It could have collapsed. But I'm curious, what led you to decide to focus on Eisenhower?
I think the thing that fascinated me the most about Dwight Eisenhower was the fact that here you have someone who was probably one of the most powerful generals in all of human history, who was raised by religious pacifists in a rural town in Kansas. He, from a very young age, from boyhood, wants to be a general, but confronted with the fact that he may not be commissioned in the army, looks to a backup plan of becoming a gaucho in Argentina. He is warned, and this is something I discovered in the course of researching this book, he is warned in a classified briefing that the Nazis are not only developing nuclear weapons, but are potentially going to deploy them against the invasion troops on D-Day. But he's told there's basically nothing he can do about it, and he can't even really tell anyone about it. And so he focuses on the things that he can get some control over, such as the weather. And he's just such a fascinating figure. He's just as complex, as human, and in some ways as contradictory as America itself. And how could you not be interested, right? How could you not want to write about someone like that?
My wife, Callista, who's from a small town, Whitehall, Wisconsin, was fascinated because there's an even smaller town nearby called Pigeon Falls, and it actually has Reynolds Tomter, who at 107 years of age has gone to Normandy. This year, he's at Normandy, one of the great moments of his life. He was the oldest surviving member of the Merchant Marine, and that was his background. And of course, the Merchant Marine played a huge role in making sure we had enough equipment, enough people to Britain, and enough food for Britain to survive. But it really brought home how every single town in America had somebody involved in World War II. And in that sense, Eisenhower emerged, I think, as the quintessential American, as somebody who somehow represented the common sense and the decency, sort of call me Ike. And yet at the same time, he clearly understood power, and he clearly understood that he was a five-star general. So he played both roles at the same time.
He did. And I would say he understood as well that in order to wield power, as much power as he had at his disposal, and in order to wield that power effectively, it was all the more important for him to not forget where he was from, to maintain that common touch, and particularly to maintain and always show that famous Eisenhower smile. I think it was Omar Bradley who said Eisenhower's smile is worth 10 divisions. And I think that's exactly right, because he had the ability to connect with people at a human level and understand really, because fundamentally, I think he was just a very serious person. He understood the weight that was on his shoulders. He bore that weight, but he never let it stop him from doing what needed to get done as well, right? He could also, if you pardon the expression, could be a bit ruthless as well. And he knew what had to get done because he was always focused on a mission ultimately larger than himself. And that sort of strength of character and that humility combined with a real desire to, make real change in the world, not just to, put more pretty ribbons on his chest or become a famous celebrity in his own right, but to really make meaningful change and lasting change in the world that would affect people, is probably both, again, an amazing testament to his character, but I think, as you said, something fundamentally and almost quintessentially American in its outlook.
Years ago, I spent time reading Eisenhower's papers because I wanted to understand how his mind worked and how he wrote and how he put things together. And he has this real knack of boiling things down, and ultimately got into a habit of saying he wanted all decision papers to be one page, that you had the job of figuring out exactly what was at stake and what the pro and con was. And he didn't want you to turn that over and make that his job. His job was to then decide. At the same time, I think behind the smile, he was amazingly smarter. It reminds me a little bit of Reagan in the desire to be underestimated, that he was quite happy if you thought he was easy to take. Somebody wrote a paper years later when the liberals all had contempt for him, etc. And they pointed out that in the 30s, on a very limited salary of an army officer, that Eisenhower played bridge and consistently won. And they said, this is not the guy you think he is. There's much more there. When you look at Normandy itself, because this is the 80th anniversary, what comes to mind? What is it you wish people understood about why D-Day, the 6th of June, matters?
I would say two things. The one thing is that I think most people forget how improbable it was and how close to failure it was at so many different moments in so many different ways. Even a month before the invasion, Eisenhower's chief of staff in Europe, Walter Bedell Smith, Beadle Smith, gave the odds of success at 50-50, which meant that the odds of failure were also 50-50. And it was a tremendous gamble that took an incredible amount of strain. Eisenhower, I think, gets up to about 3 packs of cigarettes a day by the time D-Day launches, just under the strain of all the moving parts that he has to keep in place to make it all happen. So that's one thing, is that just how difficult it was not just what those men, those brave men who were gunned down on places like Omaha Beach confronted. It was so improbable. You had almost 2 million people in one way or another contributing to this effort that at any moment could have failed. So I think that's one thing, is to remember how close we came to losing. And just as important is how important it was that we won. And I think that's also the very important legacy that D-Day fits in the American story, much like Lexington and Concord. It's this pivotal moment where the United States changes after that. Prior to the D-Day invasion, the United States was an increasingly large economy, but an untested and unproven military. Certainly for the first 2 years of the war, the British were often described as the senior partner in the Atlantic relationship, and that made a lot of sense. The British Empire was a quarter of the world, covered about a fifth of the world's surface. The Royal Navy was in every ocean, had a port on every continent. And the United States was a deeply divided, highly fractious collection of 48 states that had gone to war with one another not all that long ago. And there was a real question about whether it could muster all of that energy into being a nation state, a superpower on the world stage. And ultimately, the D-Day invasion is that moment, because it is the first American-led operation of the war of sort of major significance. It's the first time America is directing the strategic direction of the European war over the sort of British preferences, particularly to continue operations in the Mediterranean. And it is done through almost a quintessentially American view of how this new post-war world should be conducted. Because, if you think about why it was the British Empire was as powerful it was and all the other European empires, it was because that was the way of the world. The imperial rivalry was foreign policy. And the idea that you could have multilateral institutions that were organized around things like democracy, freedom, human rights, and decolonization was at best an aspiration, and certainly far from proven. And the success of D-Day showed the United States really leading the world in a new direction. And had the D-Day invasion failed, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see how different the world would have been very quickly, and how different certainly the world would be today.
Somebody once said that D-Day really mattered in part because, given all of the terrible losses of World War I, we might not have had the nerve to try a second time. That if we had launched an operation this big and it failed, that in fact we would have sort of been out of business, leaving it to the Soviets and the Germans to fight it out with whatever outcome that led to. What's your sense? Do you think if it had failed, that it would have been almost impossible for the Allied powers in the West to find the nerve to come back and do it again?
I have no doubt about that. The British had never really supported Operation Overlord. They had been skeptical of it from its first iterations in 1942 and up through the Cairo conference, when the D-Day invasion is officially set to launch in November of 1943. The British are deeply opposed. They want to, for good and bad reasons, let me just preface that, but they want to continue operations in the Mediterranean to essentially strangle the Germans from abroad. They want to use their superior air power to bomb German industry into submission, and they want to use their superior naval power to essentially contain Germany on the European continent, and not for nothing to contain the Soviet Union's expansion into the Eastern Mediterranean. And the United States and Britain almost get into a brawl, actually, at this summit in Cairo in 1943 over the choice between the D-Day invasion and continued operations in the Mediterranean. Had the D-Day invasion failed, as many, and most especially Winston Churchill, both feared and predicted it would, the United States would have been discredited before it really had any credibility in the world as a major military power. The Allies would have had to fully commit to the British strategy in the Mediterranean. That would have left the Soviets as the only major rival to Nazi Germany on the European continent. The Soviets, would they have continued to fight all the way to Berlin without us opening a Western front? Could they have? I don't know that that's entirely clear. And would the Soviet Union have cut a separate piece, essentially remaking the European continent with Soviet communism in the East and sort of Hitlerite fascism in the West? I think that's a very real scenario. But then you can very quickly even get into, real sci-fi level hypotheticals, because had the war in Germany ended only 3 months later, had VE Day been only delayed by 3 months, the United States would have acquired operating nuclear weapons. And so would the United States have attempted to resolve the European war by using nuclear weapons? Would the United States have abandoned Europe? I think that's a real possibility, because the European war, we remember it, and certainly we remember our victory over fascism in Europe today as one of our nation's great moments of pride. But Roosevelt was up for election in 1944, and the European war was not a popular item on the American political agenda. Most Americans thought the United States should be focusing on the war in the Pacific and defeating Japan, who had attacked us. And Roosevelt's willingness to spend blood and treasure in Europe came at a political cost. Would he have continued to incur that political cost if something like the D-Day invasion, which had committed 177,000 men to crossing the English Channel into France, had that faltered, had tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of men been lost or captured by the Germans? Would Roosevelt have essentially cut and run from the European theater? Would he have even won re-election? These are questions of great counterfactual history that a great novelist, I think, could entertain. But it's very easy to see how the world that we live in today would be so radically different had the D-Day invasion failed.
One of the things that makes it almost mystical is the role of weather. Talk a little bit about that, because it's one of the most fascinating aspects of how Normandy unfolded and Eisenhower's role in decision-making, all wrapped into one, and the indirect consequence, which we'll get to.
Sure. So, Eisenhower comes to London in January of 1944 and discovers that there are meteorologists everywhere. And because these are meteorologists, like any good weatherman, the predictions are literally all over the map. And the Army has their meteorologists, the Navy has theirs, the British have theirs. And one of the first orders of business, once he begins to sort of direct the operation of Operation Overlord, is to consolidate all of that. And so he gets this Scottish meteorologist. They stuff him in a military uniform, and Eisenhower basically makes him James Martin Stagg, the commander for weather. And week after week, Eisenhower brings him to the commanders' conference, where he has to stand and deliver right next to the naval commander, the army commander, the air commanders. And Eisenhower asks him to predict the weather each week. And week after week, they start just seeing how good James Martin Stagg is at this job. And it got to the point where Eisenhower, it was said, could read James Martin Stagg like a poker player. And that mattered because on June 3rd, just on the eve of the launch of the original D-Day invasion, which was scheduled for June 5th, Stagg comes to Eisenhower and says, "We have reports from out in the Atlantic, and a storm is brewing. The clouds will make any air support or any airborne operations completely infeasible. The visibility will prevent the naval guns from doing much good, and the sea is going to boil. And so these landing craft that are going to be trying to take the Normandy shores, if they get to shore, the men on those boats will be, if nothing else, seasick." And Eisenhower calls a meeting of his commanders, and there's some dissent about this, whether or not they should go as scheduled, because if they delay the operation, they only have a short window in which to launch it, up to June 7th. And if they delay it, they're going to have to delay at least by a month, and there are any number of grave consequences that might flow from that. But Eisenhower, against his gut, goes with James Martin Stagg's prediction. And I say against his gut because, as it's described at the time, the weather in southern England, in Portsmouth, where they're convening for the launching of the invasion, is gorgeous. It's blue skies, it's hot. No one can remember the weather being ever as beautiful in southern England at this time of year. But Eisenhower trusts this general for weather, who he had come to understand and be able to read like a poker player. And sure enough, as June 4th rolls in, the winds pick up, the clouds come in, the rains and the wind meet every one of Martin Stagg's predictions and then some. It's now some of the worst weather they've experienced in Portsmouth at that time of year in anyone's memory. And it's beginning to look hopeless. But then Stagg comes back and says, there's a gap. Based on our detection and our measurements out deep in the Atlantic, there's going to be a brief window from about June 6th to June 7th where the storms that we are now enduring will be pulled back out into the Atlantic, and there'll be this brief gap in weather where the invasion will be possible. And again, Eisenhower is put at a conflict between just his gut and common sense and looking out the window and James Martin Stagg. And they end up holding a command conference to make the final decision. And it's about 5:30 in the morning in this old manor house called Southwick House. And it's Eisenhower and his top commanders. They all agree that they should go if they can. And the rain is just drumming down on the windows. The wind is howling around this old creaky mansion. And it's up to Eisenhower. And he sits there, and people say it felt like it took 10 minutes of him just sitting there quietly. In reality, it was probably 10 seconds. And he looks in the eyes of all his commanders and then just says, okay, let's go. And that's the call. And in that moment, everyone in that room jumps like they're a football team running out onto the field. And there's this brief moment when Eisenhower is just sitting in that room alone, having made the gravest of possible decisions to send this massive armada with so many lives at stake, literally the freedom of the world at stake, out into the middle of a storm.
The thing that makes it, I think, even more poignant is the note that Eisenhower then writes and puts in his pocket.
Yeah, absolutely. And so having done this, there's nothing else for him to do. He's done everything he can do as the overall commander of this operation. And now it's like setting a machine in motion. But he stops and he writes out a note. And that note is on the expectation, or in the eventuality is probably a better way of saying it, that the invasion fails. And what's so poignant about this note is, and I spent so much time just looking at it because it's handwritten and there are a lot of crossing outs. And it's an announcement. It's essentially little more than a press release to basically say our landings in Cherbourg have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold and the troops have been withdrawn, right? It's an announcement of the failure of this operation. But every time you can see him starting to make an excuse or make it about him or try and have some explanation for why everything failed, he stops and he crosses it out. And at the end, he simply says that the troops in the air and the Navy just did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. And if any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone. And he puts a period on that, puts an underline on it, and puts it in his wallet in case the worst actually does happen. And in reading that letter, and particularly reading his thought process, all the changes he made to make it all about the sacrifices of the men under his command and all the blame, taking all that blame onto his own shoulders for posterity, potentially, is precisely why the invasion succeeded. It's because the man who wrote that note was the one in charge of the overall operation.
Yeah, and I've always thought the moral courage to both make the decision and then to make sure, before we knew whether or not it would succeed, that if anything went wrong, he personally would carry the burden. I thought it was one of the great acts of moral courage in the 20th century. Now, there's a secondary consequence, however, Michel, that you have to share with people, because in a funny way, the bad weather actually ends up helping, because the bad weather is coming from the west, so it will pass England, and as England is clearing, northern France is getting worse. Describe in what way this actually worked out, ironically, to great advantage for the Allies.
Well, for all of the reasons that anyone looking out the window as Eisenhower made the call to go would say no sane person would launch an invasion in this weather, the Nazis looked at the weather and said no sane person is going to launch an invasion in this weather. And so Erwin Rommel, specifically, who was Hitler's general in charge of what was called the Atlantic Wall. And I'm happy to describe the Atlantic Wall more because it's a devious contraption of 140 million metric tons of concrete and every device to essentially chew any man trying to attempt to breach this great Atlantic wall into pieces before he even can get his foot on the ground. Erwin Rommel decides, well, since the weather's so bad, I may as well go home and visit my wife for her birthday. And so the German sort of attention, if nothing else, is elsewhere. Hitler, as actually, as I understand it, based on reports about Hitler's own behavior, is basically high and goes to bed completely stoned. And so it's actually difficult to wake as the invasion is happening. And even when it does, there is a sort of disbelief that the invasion is real. Most of the German high command were convinced that the Allies' main objective was to target Calais, which is a peninsula further west and actually much closer to Great Britain than the Normandy beaches are. And Eisenhower very assiduously fed into this belief by the Germans with a plan called Operation Fortitude that had fake naval traffic between radio operators pretending to be part of a great armada that was on the way to invade Calais, dummy airplanes, dummy camps in England, and probably most important of all, led by the first U.S. Army group, whose commanding officer was none other than George S. Patton. And if there was one person who haunted the dreams of the German high command, it was George S. Patton. And so when the first reports of the invasion start coming in, despite the weather, the Germans just think it's a feint. They think this is the fake out and that George S. Patton is just waiting to cross the channel into Calais as soon as they move their forces further west, because they just can't believe that George S. Patton is not at the vanguard of this operation. I'll mention this last piece is George S. Patton can't believe it either. He actually offers Eisenhower, I think it's something like $3,000 a week just to go lead a brigade in Normandy until he has to finally bring over the Third Army about a month later. And Eisenhower doesn't even take the joke because George S. Patton is pinning down German division after German division simply by being in England.
It's interesting in that sense how sometimes you can take your own head and project it into a map, what Wellington described as the danger of thinking that you know what's on the other side of the hill. In fact, you may not. Part of the German arrogance was that they were so sure they understood all this stuff that they didn't have to question themselves. And I think Eisenhower in particular had developed a real ability to say, okay, I think your point about poker, Eisenhower was a very good bridge player and a very good poker player because he understood people. And therefore, he could measure who he was up against and did so, I think, not just in terms of his enemies, but I've always thought that his instinct when he was first assigned to Europe, he's one of the people Marshall believes is capable of playing a big role. And his instinct that the number one job he had when he first got to London was to truly get to know Churchill. That if Churchill decided he liked Eisenhower, many other things would become possible. And so the amount of time he spent at dinner with Churchill, and he spent playing cards and talking and telling stories, and mostly listening, because when you're with Churchill, you tended to listen rather than talk. His instinct for how people operated was remarkable.
And it is. And I would actually ask this question of you as sort of one of the great politicians of the 20th century. To me, he seems to have an almost preternatural political instinct, the touch for understanding that at the end of the day, relationships are how things get done. And you can have all of the best laid plans, you can have all of the military equipment in the world, but at the end of the day, it's getting people to move in the same direction. That's a fundamentally human endeavor, not a logical or mathematical one.
I say this in part because my dad was a career soldier, and I got to spend as a child 3 years at Fort Riley, not far from where Eisenhower was raised. It may well have been things he learned growing up in small-town Kansas. It was something that Bob Dole and I talked about on occasion, that there was in that generation, you measured people and they mattered, and you spent time on it. And Dole, of course, was of the generation that revered Eisenhower. You also got the same experience with Dole, that one-on-one relationships really mattered, and that you either were honorable and trustworthy or you weren't, and you either could work together or you couldn't. And from that, many other things became possible. And I think that Ike had that instinct. On the other front, people tended to forget that when he was out of the Army during the period after he retired as Chief of Staff of the Army and before he went back in to organize NATO, he was President of Colombia. And very few people realize that he actually was translating Thucydides from the Greek as a hobby, just to keep his mind going. Now, conversely, you may know this story that the intellectuals all despised him in part because he read a lot of Westerns. He said, if you're making the kind of decisions I'm making every day, you don't need heavy fiction. You need something that lets you just plain relax. And it didn't bother him because he thought what he was doing made perfect sense. And I think it did. In your mind, looking at all this, how would you measure the transition that Eisenhower made from general to being president?
One of the things that I took away, so just give you a quick methodological geek out a second on method and how I wrote this book, just because there's been so much written about certainly D-Day and even Eisenhower. And I felt that some of it did him a disservice in terms of treating him more as an icon than as a person, and really trying to get into how it was that someone from the middle of Kansas was able to ascend the heights and be a rival to someone like Roosevelt and Churchill and all these other major figures of the period. And to do that, I spent a lot of time just sticking to the primary sources throughout his biography. But with respect to the 6 months leading up to D-Day, my main approach was, after I found his day planners and his log of visitors, I just tried to individually reconstruct almost every day of his life to really get a sense of the real time concerns he had, what was really taking up his time, and just trying to be a fly on the wall, basically, was my approach. And I came away from it just feeling so stressed out, right? Just the number of things on his plate from so many different directions. You know, it hardly surprised me that he developed a cold that never went away, that he started developing a ringing in the ears, a sty formed in his eye, right? Not to mention all the smoking. So one thing I've kind of think, I say in jest, but I think happens to also probably be true, is I think the presidency was a lot easier for him, certainly than this period, because he had, by that point, more wisdom. He was older. And I think also he had understood the stakes of all of these things and how sometimes good decisions are going to go the wrong way and bad decisions will go the right way. And that his job ultimately is to make the best possible decision he can based on the best information he can. And that's his only job. And being able to sort of understand his role in that way, I thought was one of the most fascinating things that I could sort of see developing in his character, which certainly in his presidential period, I think where there are rife examples where he very carefully thought, just like with this Westerns point you mentioned, he was very careful about how he thought. He was very meticulous in a way about keeping his mind as clear and as stable as he possibly could, knowing that the hard decisions were just going to keep coming. Like there's always going to just be a torrent of noise that he had to be able to see through in order to make the best possible decisions. And so, you know, I think his transition from certainly a leading Operation Overlord to the presidency was helped by the maturity and just the practice in being a decider, to borrow a phrase from George W. Bush, right? That is really your job. And the most important thing you can do is having the best possible people in place to do the jobs that you need them to do. And then just keep your mind as clear as possible and able as possible to make hard decisions under ambiguous circumstances, right? Where you don't know what the right answer is. And the only thing you can do is make the best answer. And so I think that was a big difference. I think one of his, in reading about the period of his transition, I think one of the things he did have to adjust to in political life was celebrity, because he hadn't really been much of a celebrity until the start of Operation Overlord. A lot of generals had gotten famous, but he had to slowly learn that he no longer had privacy. And I think that was really hard on him because he was a fairly contemplative guy, despite some of the barbs that got thrown at him. And so he learned to take himself not all that seriously as a way of dealing with fame. And he has, I think, a pretty wry sense of humor about himself as well, that he then took into the presidency and probably kept him sane. The last thing I'll say about his transition, and maybe these are a little slightly more specific, is a lot of the lessons he is forced to learn in the lead up to Operation Overlord. And this, to me, was one of the more fascinating pieces of this story. Echo the hard decisions he has to make as president. And that runs the gamut. I mentioned nuclear weapons. He's the first president to be known as the leader of the free world. And on his shoulders during that time is the shift towards a nuclear armed world. And so these are issues that he's now had to think about for 10 years and think about in really quite stark terms. Civil rights is an issue that we don't often think about in the context of the Second World War, but it took up an inordinate amount of his time and attention, even during the D-Day landings. Thurgood Marshall, in fact, actually writes him a nasty cable like a day or two after the D-Day landings, based on essentially the handling of some cases involving some black soldiers. And so he has to sort of navigate these really touchy, difficult problems of civil rights. The military-industrial complex. This often comes up, particularly in the context of the debate over the use of air power in the Second World War. And he begins to see the dangers that accrue when you have a essentially ideologically driven part of the military that believes that it is at the vanguard of the future and really enjoys bloating its budgets up without really thinking historically about what the military needs, how wars are actually won. I think that's an interesting lesson that he very much takes forward into the presidency. And then also just, as you said, that human touch, that understanding that relationships are one-on-one, because all of the major figures he ends up dealing with in the 1950s, in one way or another, are people he met or got to know oftentimes in this period of 6 months, whether or not that's Joseph Stalin, whether or not that's other Russian generals like General Zhukov, certainly Winston Churchill or Anthony Eden. On the British side, Charles de Gaulle plays a very large role, as you know, in this story and in the continuing sort of saga of France in the 1950s and then 60s. So I don't want to overstate this, but one of the things that made this a real joy to write and research, really even more than to write, was just the sort of portrait of a president you get as a young man, right? How you see him growing from this very competent, very able, very admirable military figure into being the kind of person who is, as you said, something like a modern day George Washington.
I share your affection and admiration for President Eisenhower and for the extraordinary achievements. And certainly D-Day is a pretty good time to remember what an enormous contribution he made. Michel, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. I think it's an incredibly important book. I encourage everyone to get a copy and to remember on this 80th anniversary of D-Day what was at stake and the courage it took.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to my guest, Michel Paradis. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Light of Battle, Eisenhower, D-Day, and the Birth of the American Superpower on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.